You are very welcome to today's workshop, The Process of Coping with Your Child's Diagnosis. My name is Fiona Hall. I'm a counsellor and psychotherapist. I have delivered numerous workshops throughout Ireland for parents of children with a diagnosis. I have counselled parents of children with a diagnosis, and I'm also mum to a child who has a double diagnosis. Often parents, when they're going down the road of getting a diagnosis, it can be quite scary. You can feel unsure. For some parents it might be, there might be difficult behaviours at home, but these can be explained away by, my child is very young. Perhaps they go to creche or school and the teachers are pointing out that perhaps there's challenging behaviours or something needs to be looked at further. Again, we can explain that away perhaps our child is just adjusting to school. Or there could be challenging behaviours at home. And again, we can always put these down to maybe my child was hungry or tired. However, collectively, once a picture starts to emerge of challenges and difficulties your child is experiencing, you may then decide to have these looked at further and go down the road of having a diagnosis. For other parents, it might be they have this innate sense that there are difficulties there. Perhaps they have another child with a diagnosis, or they know other parents of children with a diagnosis, and there seems to be similar behavioural patterns there. There is no one route on the same journey, which is to get a diagnosis. And knowing that your child has difficulties or challenging behaviours and suspecting that perhaps there is a diagnosis there is very different from actually being sat down and handed a piece of paper. This is your child's diagnosis. And parents can often feel very overwhelmed and upset, or they find it difficult because they find that news so painful, because we all have visions of what our children's life will be like from the moment we get pregnant or the moment the child is born. And then this unexpected development can affect how we see that picture now, how we view that picture now. So in today's workshop, we are going to look at an emotional framework that parents often go through after getting a diagnosis. So we're going to firstly look at denial. With lots of parents I've worked with in the workshops and have spoken to as clients, denial can be a common response to getting a diagnosis, and it is usually a temporary way of thinking, feeling and being. It can become a lot more complex if that becomes a permanent way of thinking and feeling and being, but normally it's just a temporary response. It's like a coping strategy, a defense mechanism. There's just so much information coming at you. And again, going back to this image or vision or dreams you had for your child as they grew up, and you had this image, and this image is now may feel fractured or taken from you. And that can be a lot to process immediately, because it's hard. It is difficult. But as I said, it usually is temporary, and parents might try and block it out by throwing themselves into work, throwing themselves into sporting activities, throwing themselves basically into any other aspect of their life than dealing with the diagnosis. And different thoughts of parents I've worked with over the years, could be, oh, the consultant must have got that wrong. Okay, that is one way of being. And you might go for a second diagnosis, but if the second diagnosis comes back as the first diagnosis, where do you see that kind of going? And or you could say, sure, all children do that. And there are a lot of behaviours that a child with a diagnosis might have that a child without a diagnosis might have. But if it's an accumulative effect, as in it's coming from creche, it's coming from or school, or there's difficulties at home or with a childminder, and collectively a picture is beginning to emerge. It will take a while to absorb how you feel about that, and then for other parents it would be, but my child doesn't fit the picture of a child with a diagnosis. But what is the picture of a child with a diagnosis? Maybe something you've seen in a movie or in a play or read about in a book. Every single child is different, and every single child with a diagnosis is different. There is no one size fits all, and I suppose it's just important to remember that two children of exactly the same age with the same diagnosis may have different interests, different hobbies, different way of seeing the world, different difficulties. It is not a one size fits all. We are now going to look at anger. It's not uncommon for parents to feel very angry after getting a diagnosis. And, sometimes the anger and using that in a productive way can help you manage the process of working through your emotions. For example, as we all know, there isn't a huge amount of services available all of the time. And sometimes when we feel very angry, it can, push us on to keep trying to get services for our children and can keep us motivated and keep us on track. But I suppose with denial, as long as it's a temporary phase and is directed at results, then it can be quite helpful because it's okay to feel how you feel. However, if it is more of a long-term situation where you're angry at the world and you're angry at friends who don't have children with a diagnosis, or you're just feeling angry all of the time, that is ultimately not going to be helpful or supportive to you, your child, or your family unit. And thought patterns that clients might say is like, it's just not fair, it's not fair. How come, his peers can have those same type of behaviours, but they don't have a diagnosis? But how do you know they don't have a diagnosis? Often, parents I've worked with don't tell other people that their child has a diagnosis. They choose to keep that within the family. So just because you perceive a situation to be one way, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the reality for the other family. Or other parents might be very angry, and why can't my child behave exactly like everybody else in his or her class? Because they can't. Because they have a diagnosis. Because they see the world in amazing ways that we don't see the world. And they can't just fit into our perception or other people's perception of how children behave, because they can't. Or I'd work with parents, say, and for anybody watching this who has a child, say, with a diagnosis, and you go out and try and get something to eat. Next thing, the salt, pepper is flying, the plates are getting knocked over, drinks are getting spilled, plates are getting knocked over. Maybe there's a bit of an emotional meltdown, and you leave the restaurant swearing, I am never going to do this again. And in the meantime, you've watched this other family with what you perceive to be their perfectly behaved children, and everything is very calm. But again, that may have been that family's one good day for a long time. So just to be mindful that you don't fuel your anger with perceptions of how other people are living their lives and comparing that to your current emotional state, because we don't know what goes on for other people in their lives. So we're now going to look at bargaining. And as I mentioned earlier on, each one of these emotional stages serves a purpose. For example, with denial, it's a buffering system, a coping mechanism, a strategy to help you through a difficult time. With anger, that can be the energy that you need to keep yourself motivated, to get supports for your child, to get services for your child. And with bargaining is like something to hold on to in times of upheaval. It's a way of processing because you feel scared and vulnerable, and it's like a way to regain control. And again, very common with parents I have worked with both privately and in the workshops. And it might be, I'm going to go and get a second diagnosis. The same with denial. And that's absolutely every parent's right to go and double check. However, if the second diagnosis comes back as the first diagnosis, what then? Are we possibly going to look at a third diagnosis? And if that comes back, what then? And again, this is all very understandable. Dealing with the diagnosis can be a huge deal for parents. Other things I've come across where parents would say, oh, I'm just going to fix my parenting style. If I fix my parenting style, this will all go away. I'll either be more firm with my child, or I'll be less firm with my child, or I'll be, more accommodating with my child, or I'll change this about the way I parent. But parenting style is not going to change a diagnosis, much and all as you might like to think that. It's not. And other things that I've come across with parents as a way of bargaining, it'd be like, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to move house, and maybe we live in the city and it's too busy and it's too stimulating for my child, so we're going to move down the country somewhere and we'll have a quieter, less hectic pace of life. I would always advise clients after getting a diagnosis not to make any rash decisions. Other decisions I've come across where parents would be like, right, that's it, I'm going to give up my job, I'm going to make this better, I'm going to be around 24/7, maybe my child just needs me there more to kind of scaffold throughout the day. And in theory, they all sound like really good ideas. However, after getting a diagnosis, it can be very stressful for both the parents and in the family unit. And then deciding to up sticks and move to a completely different neighbourhood or county where you don't know anybody. How is that ultimately going to make this situation a bit easier for you, or a bit more understanding of what's going on? And again, if one parent decides that's it, I'm going to pack up my job and I'm going to just devote myself to the situation. But if your child is in school, how is that going to, a good chunk of your day you're going to be by yourself, and resources can tend to cost money if people have to go privately. And if a family's already in shock and then a double income goes down to one income, further down the line that's going to have other consequences. So I would always advise clients just to be mindful at the start. There can be a lot going on for you emotionally. You might be on one page, another parent might be on the other page, and that all needs to be worked through, plus your own stuff. Or some parents I would work with use good old Google, and they put in sort of the behaviours or the characteristics, and of course you're going to get a different diagnosis. Look, we all do it, but Google is not going to be your friend in these circumstances, because if a highly qualified person has given a diagnosis, does that have more value than Google? And I think we all know, that Google may not always be your friend. Or you'd have parents who want to bargain with a higher power. If you make this go away, I'll be a better person. If you make this go away, I will change how I live my life. And again, it's a coping strategy. And as long as this is just temporary to help us process everything that's coming our way, I can understand why parents feel like that. But as long as it's not too many rash decisions that it's going to put even more pressure on a very pressurized and stressful situation. So for me personally, I would advise clients, there's no rash decisions while you're trying to process stuff, because the processing is difficult enough as it is without other aspects coming at you as well. So we're now coming to sadness. And a lot of the parents I've worked with or spoken to over the years have at times felt very sad about the whole situation and just feel so overwhelmed, regardless of whether they expected the diagnosis or it came as a complete shock. The facts are still the same, that the child does have a diagnosis. And sometimes parents can feel so sad and overwhelmed that they just need to retreat and regroup. It's not like denial, they're not in denial. It's they have accepted perhaps what's happening or are aware that, this is what's happening, this is what's been going on for my child, but for how long? Could I have done something different? And again, it is just part of the process. It is okay to feel sad. It is okay to cry. And often parents think that they are alone in this journey, and you are not alone. There are thousands of parents in this country who feel just like you do right now. And there are many thousands of parents heading down the road of a diagnosis who may feel like you feel right now. And there may be other parents who've worked through the process of sadness, but know what it's like to feel that sadness and to question, how did this happen? Was it something I did? No, is the answer to that one. And I need someone to tell me it's going to be okay. How am I going to get through this? How are we going to get through this? And in some ways, going through that period of sadness, it's like, the reality is beginning to sink in a little bit. And again, we're going back to the image or the picture that we had in our heads when we were pregnant or when the child was born, and how their lives were going to be. And then we didn't see this coming. There was no preparation for it. And it's a matter of integrating all of this. And in some ways, sadness as part of the process, it just means maybe the information is beginning to sink in, and that we now need to readjust those hopes and dreams we had for our child. It doesn't mean they are broken forever. It may just mean that there's different tweaks and adjustments. And also we have to remember, these were our dreams for our children. Our children have their own dreams too about where they might like to go in the world, what they would like to do with their lives, what would make them happy. So as I said, it's just part of the process. It's perfectly understandable, and it is okay to cry and feel sad. It will hopefully pass. There may be an underlying level of sadness for a while, but again, it's just part of the process, and it's something to be worked through. And then you might at some point come out of it, and then, as I said, there's a roadblock and you're going back to feeling a certain amount of sadness, but perhaps not as deep as the first level of sadness you went through. We're now going to look at acceptance. And this is one, I suppose, of the stages that some people can really struggle to accept the diagnosis of their child. I mean, a lot of parents I've worked with do get to the point of acceptance, and unfortunately some parents just find the whole thing so overwhelming. But based on my clinical experience, my own experience with my child, from talking to other parents in the workshops, when you can actually get to the point of acceptance of the diagnosis, it's so less draining than all of the other stages. And not only that, it allows you to refocus on your child's abilities, because having a diagnosis is part of who your child is. It's not them in all of their entirety. And when you can get to the point of acceptance, it means you're not fighting against reality. You're not trying to ignore reality. You're not trying to let that information sink in and you're fighting against it. Those stages are the very emotionally draining and stressful stages. Whereas when you can actually get to the point of acceptance, you can rebuild that dream or vision that you had for your child in an altered format. And it can also help hugely your relationship with your child, because at some stage our children are going to grow up and make friends, hopefully, and go out into the world. And if it comes from a home that as a parent you find it really difficult to accept the diagnosis, how is that going to impact on your child, that you find it really difficult to accept a part of who they are, part of their reality? And at the end of the day, it is their diagnosis, and they are going to have to go out in the world and go to school and make friends, relationships, maybe work, maybe college. And by fostering an image of acceptance at home, encourages your child to accept, this is part of who I am. This is the part of me that sees the world differently, perhaps to other people, or perceives the world differently through other people. It is neither right nor wrong. It's just me. So by being able to embrace the diagnosis, and it's not easy, and I know a lot of parents go through various different hurdles and different stages, and it can be even more complex when one parent is at one stage, the other parent is at the other stage, and you can't really force anyone to feel differently about a situation. That is something that they need to work through themselves by keeping communication open. And for some parents it might be, look, we're just going to talk about it for an hour every Monday night, and after that we'll just let it go for the moment, so it doesn't become huge if one parent is struggling and maybe another parent is at acceptance. It's a matter of trying to work together where possible. And as I said, acceptance, even though this might sound really strange, is one of the easiest and less emotional ways of being. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be really hard to get there, but once you are there, you're dealing with reality. You're better able to focus on your child's needs, focus on how things maybe have to change a little bit at home. And reality is always so much easier to deal with because it's actually just less complicated. So yes, I acknowledge getting to acceptance can be difficult and challenging for parents, but when you're dealing with reality and you have acceptance and your child sees acceptance in you, so if you can accept the diagnosis and if they can accept the diagnosis, that can be really great for children to integrate that part of themselves into who they are and how they're going to be in the world, and can just be really important for their own development. As I have mentioned during this video today, it is not uncommon for parents to be at different stages in their emotional framework about the diagnosis. And particularly at the start, when you get your piece of paper with the diagnosis, regardless of whether you were expecting it or not expecting it, it can come as a big shock when reality is laid out in black and white on paper. And so for some parents, both of them want to talk about it all of the time, and it can be very overwhelming because it seems to be just the only topic of conversation. Or one parent might want to talk about it all of the time, and another parent is maybe in denial and is finding that really challenging and difficult to be there for the other parent whilst also trying to be there for themselves. And unfortunately, I have come across situations where things have deteriorated amongst parents because they're both in different spaces. One wants the other one to be on the same page as them. That person isn't able to be on that page. So just to be mindful that you don't allow the situation regarding the diagnosis and how each parent feels about it to take over your relationship. It's still important to take time out for each other where it's not the topic of conversation or only the topic of conversation. It's still important to do things either as a couple or individually or as a family that you did before you got the piece of paper. Because, if you think about it, your child has not changed one iota from the time the day before the diagnosis to the day after the diagnosis. What's changed is you as a parent and how you're interpreting this information and how you're taking this information and comparing it to this picture and dream and we have in our heads. Your child hasn't changed one bit in that whole time frame. So it's important to acknowledge that this is your emotions as a parent, and to understand that maybe the other parent, just for whatever reasons, maybe the way they were raised or their parenting style, is having difficulties processing that information and is not at the same page. And maybe I mentioned earlier, like, you set aside a certain time frame. So if somebody is feeling very overwhelmed, they may not be able to have the headspace for a 2-hour conversation. It might be, okay, on a Monday night, when the kids are in bed, we're going to talk about this, this, and this, and we've got 1 hour. And then try to keep firm boundaries around that. So, one or both parents can kind of think about what the other parent has had to say, go away, process that, and then come back again when they have other things to add into that conversation. So it is important, I suppose, that it doesn't turn into kind of a very negative experience in the house, which can be very understandable when people are under a lot of pressure. It's more about being able to compartmentalize, and in a way everything serves a purpose, and being able to compartmentalize means that you're not feeling really flooded and then very overwhelmed and then very triggered by about what's going on. So just to bear that in mind. So we're just coming to the end of today's video for parents of children with a diagnosis. And just to recap briefly, the emotional framework that we spoke about, the denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and acceptance, it is not a linear path. You may feel 3 of these emotions in the one particular day. And just to understand that you are not alone in this. There are lots of parents who feel exactly like you do. And, that you may feel one way, the other parent might feel another way. There is no right or wrong way to work through this process. Different people jump on at different stages, and then some people might make a huge amount of progress and then maybe hit a setback and then kind of maybe feel very angry or sad about that. But the thing is, in life, we're all going to face setbacks. It's just part of life. But again, just to remind any parent who's watching this, you are not alone. There are thousands of parents out there right now who feel just like you do. So just please remember that. So thank you for watching this video, and hopefully you found it helpful.